Hello, and welcome to Too Broad and Too Deep, a podcast where we talk about the Doctor Who Virgin New Adventure novels, starting from Timewyrm Genesis, all the way through to the dying days. I'm joined by Alasdair.
Hello.
And also, we have a special guest. We have the lovely Jim Trenowden. Jim, how are you doing?
Yeah, very good, thank you. Thank you for having me. Look forward to this.
No worries at all, it's good to have you. It's an area which I didn't think had many fans within the fandom, but people are coming out of the woodwork to discuss the Doctor Who Virgin New Adventures in a way I didn't think they would be.
There are dozens of us.
So it's very good to see. So actually, I was wondering, in terms of the Virgin New Adventures, when did you first kind of hear about these, Jim?
Well, I got into the show generally about the time of the 92-93 repeats on BBC Two, and I was probably about 4 at the time. I remember reading about the New Adventures in DWM and really not being interested, to be honest. I was far too young for them anyway, but I don't remember them being a thing that I wanted to read, I'll be honest. I had plenty of Target books and actual telly stories to be getting on with, so yeah, just wasn't that fussed. But come the time of the TV movie, I was the exact right age to be into it and really wanted more McGann, so got really into the EDAs. If anyone's doing an EDA podcast, by the way, get me on. So I ploughed through those and sort of considered myself to be a Doctor Who book fan, I guess, at that point, and thought, well, teenage me rolls around and thinks, I should probably give these New Adventures a go. I've heard so much about them. They've got these really passionate fans online. So I started picking them up, charity shops, eBay, the like, and didn't really get the appeal, didn't really get the... they were fine, absolutely fine, but just sort of plodded through them for a while until I got to Transit. And Transit killed any interest I had in continuing, I'm not going to lie. The problem is I'm a completionist when it comes to things like this, and I couldn't bring myself to skip the remainder of Transit, couldn't bring myself to finish it, and that just stopped my my New Adventures journey. I dipped in a few times after that, so picked up Human Nature, Shakedown, The Dying Days even. Enjoyed them well enough. But then, it was only actually about early last year, that I thought maybe I should give these another go, give them a fair kind of, made my way through the Timewyrm books again. And then I think, Anthony, you said to me at one of the Riverside events, I'm thinking about doing a podcast about these. So I stopped reading through them and thought, I'll read these when you do them. It's fun, to be part of the conversation and things. And so here I am now reading the Timewyrm books for the 3rd time. And still haven't read anything past Transit, really. So it's a funny relationship I have with the New Adventures, let's put it that way.
Yeah, no, that's... I think one thing have been fearing about this down the line is Transit. From any time anyone mentions, writ large, the Virgin New Adventures, Transit is this big monolith down the line that I can see coming.
It's very much the kind of New Adventures version of the censor rights when you're doing the sort of classic series. It's the bit that people tend to trip up on, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I guess, we're here to discuss the second, as you say, book in this series with Timewyrm Exodus, written by Terrace Dick. It's Terrace Dick's first Doctor Who original novel, actually. I don't think he's done any before that. It was just all those Target novels. Did any of you read any of the Target novels, like beforehand, afterwards? In retrospect?
Yeah. So, as my little ramble there, the Target books were my intro to Doctor Who prose, I guess, and obviously Terence being the kind of daddy of the Target books in a way. I was very familiar with his writing style before going into this, and you can see a lot of it, I think, in Exodus. It feels very comfortable to read.
You can tell it's Terrace Dick. It's got his footprints all over it, and that's absolutely fine. We're good with that.
I do wonder though, like, what his draw to this era in particular, it's like World War II, kind of is for him in that way. I was trying to see what other alternative World War II stories were out there, but this came out, I want to say, just before or just maybe after Fatherland came out, which, it's in the sort of sphere of this almost revival of alternate World War II sort of thinking. But yeah, it was interesting to have him kind of delve into a more political novel when he wasn't known as the more political person when running the show. With Barry Letts during that time.
Yeah.
No, but he was a fan of the Nazi stuff, though, as he says himself. He did war games, which had a fair bit of German soldiers through it and all the rest of. He specifically requested the Nazi era and Nazis as characters because he's always found them quite interesting. Which it does make for a more nuanced version of Nazis than most other writers would do about this kind of time.
Yeah, it delves into that political sphere quite in a way I didn't expect from him. I think that's what I found surprising.
Yeah.
What took me was I kept reading the names going, I think I know that name, and I would Google it. Yeah, that was a real German. A few pages later, yep, also a real German. He was spot on in who he was picking to have as the background characters. He'd obviously read.
I suppose it's not the most original idea, really, alternate timeline, what if the Nazis won? But I guess that's only really through the lens of reading it now, that actually, certainly in Doctor Who terms, in the lens of 1991, this is pretty new territory, I guess. Although saying that, if we think of this as the continuation of the TV series, this is only a few stories after the Curse of Fenric, and as a result feels a little bit like we're treading quite recent ground. I don't know, quite a curious choice, I think, to go back to this era quite so soon in that sense. Well,
one thing that he does say within, he got interviewed in Doctor Who magazine about it. In issue 178, and he's talking about where he was getting draw of characterisation for people from, and he basically said he just sat down with a VHS of Curse of Fenric, and that was his introduction and indeed whole idea of who the Seventh Doctor and Ace was.
I can do that.
To be honest, it does have that feeling around it, even though it is relatively close in that sphere of a World War II story. It still isn't that sort of style of story from Curse of Fenric. Curse of Fenric wasn't about the Nazis in that way, although there is a zombie style race as well of people within both. It still has its own sort of take within this era.
Yeah, there's definite overtones of Curse of Fenric in the war games in this. But that's, once again, that's fine. Those are two good serials. We're happy to see them retread to a certain extent.
And I don't know if, in terms of now the book itself, it has alternative timeline as one of the aspects of this era, but it's only one half of that book in that way. As the story itself, I think actually I'll read the blurb and see how you, and indeed the listeners, might well feel about how that reflects what we might see. So this is what the blurb says on the book. The pursuit of the Timewyrm leads the Doctor and Ace to London 1951 and the Festival of Britain, a celebration of the achievements of this small country, this insignificant corner of the glorious Thousand-Year Reich. Someone or something has been interfering with the timelines, and in order to investigate, the Doctor travels further back in time to the very dawn of the Nazi evil. In the heart of the Germany of the Third Reich, he finds that this little band of thugs and misfits did not take over half the world unaided. History must be restored to its proper course, and his attempt to repair the timelines, the Doctor faces the most terrible dilemma he has ever known. Now, it focuses more so on what I think is a lot of the first half of that novel, in terms of what has changed, and a lot of the rectifying side of that isn't really. It feels like a different novel almost in terms of what it's trying to do up where it's set, compared to this sort of like almost not quite having fun in a sort of like hard-nosed historical style. The Seventh Doctor goes around trying to fit into a Nazi society in England, but it's a different take compared to when we go back to the 1930s in the second half. So yeah, how did you find each take in terms of having an alternative history and then how we go to try and deal with it in the novel?
I quite like the finding something wrong with history and then going back and fixing it aspect. feels very Moffat-y in a way, I think. In a way that I don't think the classic series did a huge amount of. As in, just time hopping in a serial generally is a little bit kind of original, I guess, at this point. You get a bit of it in things like Pyramids of Mars, but yeah, it's an interesting twist, I think. And yeah, the actual alternate timeline, I feel like more could have been done with it. I don't know, it feels a little bit half-baked to me. I get that it's only a handful of years after the war, and so it's kind of been that different, perhaps. But I don't know. Maybe I'm picturing sort of other films and the like where you see Zeppelins going around and everything's very different. And like, it just felt very kind of close to modern day, but with a few Nazis hanging around. Yeah, perhaps a bit underused.
Yeah, Alasdair, what did you make of it?
I quite enjoyed the first part. It was nicely done, nicely paced. It gave you just enough smatterings, ideas of like Mosley as Prime Minister, Edward back as King, and just it. But Jim's right, it felt very safe in the changes it was making. It was changes that everyone would be aware of and would know, and there was no great moments. There was like, yeah, this is pretty much what you'd expect to happen. Happened. Let's move on. But strangely, one of the things I really enjoyed most about it was Hemmings, the British convert type officer. He was tremendous fun. He almost felt like an archetypal German villain in an old war film going, I know they're up to no good and I will prove it. And he's the one screaming, they're up to something. Everyone's going, no, they're fine. And he's absolutely spot on, but no one's listening to him. And that was just fun. He was the one lone voice in the wilderness going, this doesn't work.
Yeah.
I read actually after the fact that he was put in as not quite as an afterthought, but Paul Cornell contacted Terrace Dick and went, I need a character I can use in book 4. Can you put someone in that I can grab? And that's where Hemmings came from. And for essentially an afterthought, he's a standout character for me. I just really, really enjoyed the guy. For a bad guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good to have that foil, isn't it? The Doctor breezes in so easily in this, and I know it's not a new thing, but like he takes over and becomes like the de facto Reich Inspector so quickly. But to have someone calling him out on this is actually quite nice, quite unique in a way. To have that foil, and yeah, as you say, in a way, quite a standout character in that he comes back, right, which is nice in itself. It's
I agree about how much of a foil he became. Because he was the only one calling out a lot of this. And I was sitting and I was like, I had to look up when Allo started, because I found some striking similarities with this and Allo in certain situations. We have that cafe where the Resistance is based upon in London, where basically the Doctor has his own Rene moment where him, as in this novel, the Doctor's in disguise as a high-ranking Nazi. He's dressed in the big leather coat and a hat, almost I dare say like Van Smallhausen from Allo. But there's this aspect when the chief ranking officer for the Nazis in the area comes in to try and arrest everyone. And he basically gives a sort of "you stupid woman" sort of moment to the Nazi officer of saying, "Don't you understand? I have this secret, elaborate plan." And it feels like that. Yeah, there's touches of Allo, but set in 1950s London, occupied by the Nazis, that I find was quite enjoyable, even if it's not that deadly serious caricatures that we expect for a more well-rounded, gritty take of a takeover from the Nazis in London.
That's it. Dick steered quite clear of the gritty aspect of it, because even when Ace and the Doctor are in prison, they're about to be tortured, the Doctor kind of punctures it with, yes, now they're going to not talk to us for hours and then shout at us. It won't work. And he's just poking fun at the whole genre, and that was fun as well. And on that note, can we really imagine any other Doctor dressing up as a Gestapo agent? And yes, I can tell from your faces it is uncomfortable. No one's going to lie about that. It wasn't comfortable seeing the Doctor dressed up as a Gestapo agent. But if any of them was going to do it, it would have to be the 7th.
Yeah, I think you're right. But it is uncomfortable. I think it's deliberately uncomfortable, right? That it's quite unpleasant having the Doctor be pally with Nazis. Obviously in service of the plot, but yeah, it doesn't feel nice to read.
Administering first aid to Hitler. Yeah.
And yeah, I guess there's elements of this all throughout the book, right? That the Doctor is working with the Nazis for a lot of this book. Not willingly, I guess, to an extent, but to make sure that World War II goes to plan. And yeah, that can lead to some quite interesting conflicts throughout the book, I think. You see Ace questioning the Doctor's motives throughout the book a fair bit, I think. And yeah, ultimately they end up best friends at the end as usual. But you can see this sowing the seeds of later kind of discontent, I guess, questioning whether the Doctor's actually all that good.
Yeah, because Gestapo's never going to be a good look for anybody, let alone the Doctor.
No,
it's in the aid of the greater good, but when you've got this supposedly heroic character dressed up as a Gestapo officer pallying around with Hitler and the Nazis and all this, you have to wonder, is he actually doing this, in the right mindset? Is he actually kind of,
Because we had elements of this in Rosa, when the Doctor had to stand by and let something horrific in history happen because that's how it happened. But that felt more passive. This was more the Doctor getting in about it. And at least Terrace Dick had the decency to put a few times, have the Doctor go, I'm going to leave before this affects me too much because this is getting to me. It's like, thank God he's acknowledging it. That's something.
On the second half of that novel, especially when he's so involved within the political intrigue within the Reich, he's playing Himmler off of Gorin, and there's a political play that it basically is his way to try and attempt to resolve the plot at the end. Essentially, he uses Gorin basically as sort of this sort of fat Nazi version of the Brigadier to come in and swoop in and save the day, to blow up the baddies for him.
I actually stopped at that point and read that paragraph out to Ellie, my wife, to say, they're just waiting for Geraint to charge in and rescue them. It's like, so what the hell are you reading?
But, he's just using those elements that, as much as we're saying there's broad strokes of these kind of characterizations, the Doctor still uses that to his advantage to try and get somewhere. The conspiratorial nature of Himmler as well. He's so engrossed in all these mad myths and legends. He wouldn't be far off from still believing there's 97 missing episodes to be found in Phil Morris's basement. So there's, a lot of characterization like that still comes very handy as an agent for the Doctor to use to try and resolve and bring things back on track, which I find quite enjoyable.
It's interesting in the context of the range, though, that both the first and second books have the Doctor and Ace ally themselves with a unpleasant historical figure for the greater good. Comes across as a tad repetitive, perhaps. I always have to wonder if another book could have been inserted in between to kind of break up the flow a little bit, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, in fact, that's one thing we haven't, I guess, discussed is, who he is facing in those historical battles, because the title of the book is Timewyrm Genesis, and the Timewyrm is barely in this book.
No,
probably for the better. But I wondered what you thought about the use of the Timewyrm within this. Alasdair, how do you find it?
Oh, I've got definite views on this one. I did not like the idea in the slightest that Hitler was influenced by an alien presence. It was.
I think we should say that that the Timewyrm at the beginning of the novel is in the mind of Hitler. This is how basically the Timewyrm was not in it as much, because it goes into the mind of Hitler and is trapped within his madness. So that's
and the idea that Hitler was a strong enough personality and a strong enough of will that he could harness the Timewyrm to his thoughts and personality was kind of disturbing. I almost felt they could have had someone else have the Timewyrm and have him in the periphery. Having Hitler affected is just... He's still too recent, he's still too evil, and a lot of what we were seeing in the book there about normal Germans buying the rhetoric, how easily people were worked up, how often people were manipulated by speeches and such, like how small wars can set things off. It was so very, very relevant to today. And the idea that you wouldn't write a book today and say Putin had been possessed by an evil alien. You wouldn't say that Donald Trump was being psychically enhanced. It's the sad truth is that Hitler did that all by himself. It just felt having the Timewyrm part of Hitler's psyche and part of Hitler's power set demeaned what happened. And what happened was absolutely horrific. There's no getting away from that. But that's a minor quibble in terms of the whole book, but it doesn't sit well, guys. It does not sit well at all.
No.
What do you guys think?
I made the exact same note, yeah. I mean, definitely not intentionally, right? But it does feel like it kind of excuses Hitler a little bit. And yeah, interesting, questionable, the whole idea of him being so brilliantly minded that he can take this, incredibly powerful alien entity and trap it with his mind. I don't know, it just didn't quite sit right to me. I have to wonder, given as well how little the Timewyrm appears in this book, whether Terence just didn't had a story in mind to tell and wanted to tell it his way, and just kind of got told by the editor, whoever, just pepper in a few references if he can, sort of thing. This could so easily not be a Timewyrm book.
Yeah,
Bailey is.
From what I've read, he was basically told, "This is what happened last time, and here's where we need it to be by the end." Which also explains the rather abrupt change of tone in the last third of the book.
Yeah, it's something that just feels arbitrary to what Terrace Dick is wanting to achieve with the novel. I last night rewatched for the first time since broadcast Let's Kill Hitler to see how Hitler has been portrayed in the television show, and there's a striking similarity actually to what Stephen Moffat does with Hitler to what Terrace Dick does with the Timewyrm, because Moffat just sticks Hitler in a cupboard and we don't see him again, and that's essentially what Terrace Dick does with the Timewyrm, of sticking it into this mental cupboard of Hitler's mind, and we don't really see the Timewyrm again till the end, where we need to Ghostbuster it out of Hitler.
That's a brilliant reference.
But
thank you for that image.
Yeah. But the Timewyrm isn't the only villain. I think we should say as well, there is to add to this another force, and it's Tubos, the one that is driving the issue that I probably have about this demeanness of Hitler, because it's with the warlords and the war chief, and how they are mentally amplifying the oratory powers of the Doctor of Hitler, in such a way that it does, like you say, undermine the natural oratory powers that people believed upon and used to their best ability to persuade people of anything. And it just felt, I wasn't a fan of how they were used. And to be honest, as much as it's a key thing that Terrace Dick wanted to bring in, it was not the best way to do it, because the Doctor talks about how it's the Timewyrm's not this sort of fine methodical sort of person to be able to fix and change and alter small bits of a timeline, but the only focus we see of the warlords and the war chief is on the mental projection and amplification aspect, and not on they're helping in a very particular way with a storm during Dunkirk, or small things that are changing things in the favour of the Nazis on the front, or something like that. It's on something that feels undermining of the impact of what the Nazis actually did and how they persuaded the German people. So what did you think of the warlords and the war chief in this novel, dredged up after 30 years, 23 years or something like that by this time? Jim, what did you think?
I mean, does this book really do anything with the idea of the warlords? I have to ask. other than some references to the original serial, this could be any entity meddling in Earth's history, I think. Swap out the names and, the little bit of... This could be the meddling monk, really.
Yeah.
Perhaps not his MO, but in terms of the methods, we don't see anything really with regards to the plot, the scheme of theirs that ties them up to the original warlords, I don't think. And, yeah, people have a go at Eric Saywood for dropping in references to, pteroleptals and Tinclavic mines in his, more recent novelisations, but this book is just the epitome of that as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, obviously there's the obvious one, bringing back the war chief, the warlords. But there is a chunk of time devoted to a recap of the Five Doctors. There are references to Khan and Old Hermits and Venusian neck pinches and all of Dix's kind of favourites. And I have to wonder, given that the first book in this range was a continuity mess, full of kisses to the past, should we say, is this kind of helping the impression that this range has something new to say? And I'm not sure it really does.
Yeah. Alasdair, how did you find their inclusion in this novel?
See, normally this is all entirely in my wheelhouse. I love past references, I love working things in, but they didn't feel part of events. And even just but I saw the war chief get disintegrated. Yes, but this is his son. Okay, that seems like a fairly major bit of information that we're going to do what with? Oh, nothing. Excellent, so glad you mentioned it. That could easily have been, but he survived. But no, he felt the need to go for it was his son instead. And it was just... The only thing of real note I took from it was the fact that the war chief had tried to regenerate and had failed. And there was essentially two bodies squashed together. But it suddenly feels a lot more relevant in the light of bi-generation. Essentially the war chief bi-generated and got it wrong and carried about his half-decimated corpse with him. Now that was it's a fairly horrific idea and it's almost glossed over. It's just...
I would love to see that now, if the toy maker kept that laser going so that there'll be suddenly just half of David Tennant coming out of half of Ncuti Gatwa, like a sort of basket case creature going around like that, with the two of their bodies stuck together as the new Doctor. That would have been...
Well, that'd have been different.
It would be very different, but they would have been precedent, so fans would have been happy.
A bit his own kiss to the past.
We're Doctor Who fans, we are never happy.
True.
I didn't like the kind of delve into regeneration bit, but that kind of felt, that could have been, as Jim said, that could have been the monk easily enough. It could have been any other Time Lord. It could have been, if the helmet, it could have been the Rani. It could have been anyone. The war chief and his cohorts just seemed tacked on. It was basically Dick's going, hey, remember, I wrote this back in the 60s. Yes, Terence, we all remember, we've all sat through it, it's fine. And that sounds dismissive, because I do enjoy the war games, but it did feel as him saying, look, I've got credentials, I'm writing this, I'm going to remind you who I am. Which is a shame, because the rest of the novel's so well done.
It's interesting in that kind of greatest hits approach rears its head again in another book of Terence, which is the Eight Doctors, the first book of the EDAs. Another book that has nothing original to say, in my opinion, and just kind of, the very format of that is going through previous adventures, but it is a kind of checklist of, hey, remember what I wrote back in the day? So he's got form.
In his defence, and I feel more comfortable saying in Terence Dick's defence than John Peel's defence, the sheer amount of stuff that Terence Dick has brought us, I think he's maybe earned a few look at me and great moments. It's a shame it tends to dominate the last chunk of the book.
But I would say that he's more humble enough to recognise when it didn't work as well, because he's, in the book, the Doctor talks about how, the warlords it was such a convoluted plan that they were trying to do back then, to try and, create the best army by making them fight against each other, and this, he basically ridicules the idea of the war games, and then again does it at the end of the novel, because he says, they just tried the same thing again, except somehow worse. So he basically kind of recognises, there's not actually really something going here for it, but I'm happy to throw it in for use, because it is, who else is going to read it?
The end of the book, though, there was one standout moment for me, and it was a visual moment where the Doctor whistles for the TARDIS, and it appears levitating in the air, and him and Dorothy. So I keep calling Dorothy. That's me portraying how far ahead I've read. Him and Ace basically stepping up and into the TARDIS. That's a fantastic visual, and not one we'd had anywhere else before in the series. We've had plenty of it now in the new series. Mark Smith basically hovered the TARDIS everywhere, but this was brand new. No one had ever thought to do this with the TARDIS before, and you could almost miss it because it's in amongst all these big action scenes, and I just loved it. It was nice.
Well, talking of the Doctor and Ace, or Dorothy, in this novel as well, I was wondering how folk found their characterisation, because, compared to the last book in Genesis, where I was just frustrated by how bitter and cold the Doctor was immediately compared to what we had before, I find this Doctor just, solid 7th Doctor, relatively fine compared to what we were having before. I don't think he was distinctly, plotting and mad schemer like we might have had at the end of season 26, but yeah, Alice, I don't know, how did you find the Doctor and Ace in this?
Oh, closer than last time around, Anthony, certainly. Interesting two histories for them, because John Peel had seen all the 7th Doctor but actively disliked the Machiavellian aspect of his character, whereas Terrace Dick had only really seen the Curse of Fenric, and he played that up to the hilt, and it's... Yeah, this Doctor's definitely closer to the Doctor we know and love, even if he does put on a Gestapo coat and shout to people. But even that's strangely in keeping with his raison d'etre of slotting in and trying to take control of the situation and slightly grey morality. Ace was definitely more like Ace than she had been in the series, with shouting about basically the mouthpiece for 20th century viewers. This is fascism, this is wrong, there's no justification for this Doctor, and it's like, yeah, she's right. She's acting like his conscience in this, and it's welcome, because she's saying all the things that we want to say. Like, what the hell are you thinking? Put the coat down. The monocle was a step too far as well, that's another story. It's just...
Yeah. Jim, how did you find it?
Yeah, I have to agree. The characterisations are a lot closer to what we saw on the TV, I think. Dix obviously has an advantage in that he's written for, well, the Doctor and Friend a bunch over the years. But yeah, I was looking through my Target books just there to sort of say, has he written for these characters before? And no, he hasn't, has he, actually? The 7th Doctor and Ace. I think the latest, sort of chronologically, he wrote was Mysterious Planet, I want to say, novelisation-wise. So yeah, like... For someone who's not actually touched these versions of the characters before, I thought they were surprisingly spot on, actually. And yeah, I think that plays to his strength that he has written for a bunch of different Doctors, a bunch of different companions, and can usually find their voice quite well, I think.
Yeah. I think, compared to, how he might have wrote a generic companion, say, in the interrogation scenes for Ace, she is very markedly just being Ace, very being cocky, being exactly who she is, compared to what he might have done for one of his companions from back in the day. He does seem to get that she is this more active and proactive character. I guess maybe similar to, him maybe not being the most political sort of person before from writing. I did notice at one point he's talking about Ace's inner thoughts about politicians, and I think it was right in page 87 it was or something, where she says to her, all politicians were weird and slightly suspect anyway, why should the Nazis be any different? And that was maybe the one line that I felt was maybe not quite what she was, because she's naturally a anti-Nazi, anti-fascist sort of character, and for her to be slightly indifferent to think, all politicians are the same in that way. I'm not saying that, because I am a politician, but, there's more nuance that Ace had in the series, I think, when it comes to being anti-fascist, that didn't quite sometimes shine through in that way. She was just generally anti-political idea in that. But I think, other than that, a lot of what her sort of gutsy character was still there in the book.
There was one nice wee meta moment that I quite liked for Ace when she screamed and then went, "I'm sorry, that wasn't me." It's like, yeah, correct. You're the one companion that wouldn't scream in the classic series. So yeah, that was.
One thought on Ace, and I think this is a sign of the era perhaps this was published in, but she drops the hard R slur a couple of times at one point in the book, and that stood out for me, I'm not going to lie. And like I said, maybe it was just 1991, it was more accepted, but yeah, I didn't like that.
No. But yeah, other than that, I think characterizations were kind of spot on in that way. I don't know if there was. I know you mentioned earlier of Hemmings, but were there any other side characters than the main ones and the villains that you thought, had a good sort of innings within this book for yourselves?
I quite like Mom and Pop. The resistance that just kind of disappeared. Once they'd been rumbled, they ran for it and were gone, but they were very well realised up until that point.
Yeah, I tried when I was writing my notes for this episode to remember what happened to Mom and Pop, and the answer is kind of nothing, right? That they seem like they're going to play a really massive role in this book, in this story, and the fight against the Nazis in the alternate timeline, and they just vanish.
Yeah.
Along with the alternate timeline, right? That it feels unresolved. It would have been nice when we cut to the end of the book, I think, to perhaps touch base with them and see them living a much nicer life, perhaps, but...
Yeah.
Well, yeah, because, I mean, they redo that scene with Harry Gold, the coffee shop man at the beginning. They kind of redo that scene in the now fixed timeline, and even just having them, having a coffee there, something like that, or they're telling off the two wee guys that come around to the stall. Something like that would have been a nice way to say they still exist and they now thrive in the regular timeline.
Although touching on that, I really like the fact that in the alternative timeline it was marked as proprietor Gold, but in the fixed timeline it was Goldstein. He was quite he left it hanging there, and that was a nice little touch, I thought.
Yeah. No, yeah, I think that was quite nice. But yeah, I guess overall, how did you find, I guess, Alasdair, compared to our last book, how did you find this overall as an experience compared to Timewyrm Genesis?
Overall, I thoroughly enjoyed it. Like I said, I staggered a wee bit in the last act, but by and large, it was fun. I couldn't put it down. I read it in pretty much 2 sittings, which is a lot fewer sittings than I did for Timewyrm Genesis. That was a real hard slog. It was just fun. Terrace Dick knows how to write the Doctor, turns out any Doctor, and he kept the pace going, and it was just fun. I can actively remember some of these characters talking to you guys. I was having to look back at my notes for Timewyrm Genesis to go, who was that again? Oh, was there something interesting? It was like, and even now I can barely remember any of it, but Timewyrm Timewyrm. See these flipping biblical names that don't actually tie very well into the books. Exodus was just fun. I just enjoyed it. Questionable Hitler things aside, but I feel it's just the one you have to excuse the Doctor playing as a Nazi and Hitler being possessed by an alien, and you can get past it. Whereas in Genesis, it felt like every third page you were making an excuse for something to enjoy it. This was a lot less problematic. Not unproblematic, but a lot less problematic. I enjoyed it. Next.
Jim, how did you find it overall in your rereading that you've been having?
Yeah, so really quite enjoyable, as Alasdair says. That actually, I thought I would just skim through this. I only read this 12 months ago. Had the broad strokes of the plot fairly well established in my head, so I thought this was just a kind of, I don't know, reminding myself of the fine details. But actually, I found myself really breezing through the book and enjoying it. Some problematic elements aside, I should say, but it's really easy to read. It does have that kind of Terrace Dick's target novelisation style, so you can breeze through it in. I think I've read this in 2 sittings, right? And yeah, it flew by. I enjoyed myself with it. I think it would probably be better remembered if it was surrounded by better books. I know that sounds like a daft thing to say, but it's a very trad Doctor Who book in a way. And perhaps if it had been surrounded by something a bit more interesting, it would stand out as, oh look, this is how you do like classic style Doctor Who in this exciting new range. As it is, it feels like it's perhaps a bit too safe compared to what came before, if that makes sense. It perhaps needs to be a bit more new and exciting.
Yeah.
But no, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it a lot.
And compared to folk who were wanting to feel that new experience and were getting that absolute sugar rush of that from the first book because of, instead of it being that regular Doctor we're used to, it's a hard crash of a different style of a Seventh Doctor. People might have went, that was too much too fast, and going back to this might have felt a bit more comfortable and comforting to fans to experience a Doctor who's still quite similar to what was in the TV show, but edges, like we said, about being under the skies as a Nazi, some of the ways that Ace behaves, those seeds of their relationship being planted, it is probably how it should have been, and so it's a bit more comforting compared to that absolute hard turn to what the series will go down to from the first book itself. So yeah, I guess just on that note, we did get some comments from folk online about this book in particular. So I'll just read a few that we had. So we got Dan Pym, who's at DevonDan03 on Twitter, said it's the best book in the Timewyrm series. And it's like one of his favourites from the range, having loved the SSGB and the Len Dayton vibes about it. But then he also loves the altered history plots in general. Interesting that Uncle Terrence's love of revisiting the war game starts so early in the original novels. Which, yeah.
It's not the first time. It's not the only time, sorry, is it? It's the first time and not the only time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's you wouldn't think it to be someone who brought the actual villains into creation to do it. You'd think it would be one of the fanboy writers to absolutely wire in with a villain from 20 odd year ago. But yeah. We also had John J.D. David at Marius Kane on Twitter saying, one of my absolute favourite books. I'm a massive fan of alternate history books, and this is a great one. Loved every minute of it. I remember it coming out in 1991, just before I headed back to my school for my final year at sixth form. So there's people who were growing up during the wilderness years at that age that, Doctor Who ought to have been there for them in that way, and it still was, just in that book form. Now, I had one or two I'll just read from Facebook we had as well, from the Virgin New Adventures group that exists over there. Lots of people were big fans of Terrance Dicks's style, basically, is the big part of it. Tony Green said it was great. I enjoyed our first episode today, although they haven't actually read Genesis because the reviews put them off, but they're currently enjoying Exodus a lot. They've only read 6 new adventures at the moment, but I'm looking forward to collect more, and at least the ones that don't cost as much as a second-hand car, which, yeah, just don't buy Long Barrel. There's PDFs available out there. There's much better ways to get it. John Hubbard as well said, I think this was the single best entry in the New Adventure range. It's a pity it's only the second one, as there was nowhere else to go after this. I don't think I would say it's the best, but I would say it's a solid entry. That if it was the first one, and we did some basic introduction to the Timewyrm, I think more people would have probably caught on to this series. Yeah, it would have been a nice, comfortable start to lean into where it goes down the line. But yeah, that was some of the comments that we got from some folk. If you do want to get in touch with your own comments about the podcast and indeed our next book, which is Timewyrm Revelation.
Yeah?
Apocalypse.
I just keep wishing it is because Apocalypse.
No, we were saying this just before we started recording. I read this last year and I don't remember anything about Apocalypse, which is probably quite telling.
Well, if you remember more than us about Timewyrm Apocalypse, please do write into us at 2broad2deep, and that's with the number 2, pod, on Twitter or Instagram, and indeed Facebook, or on our email as well, which is 2broad2deeppod twobrod@gmail.com, and that's with the word 2TOO. But yeah, on that note, thank you very much, Jim, for joining us on this episode.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's been great.
And thanks very much, Alasdair, for joining us always.
Pleasure as always, Anthony.
Thanks very much, everyone. See you soon. Thank you for joining us on another episode of Too Broad and Too Deep. You can get in touch with us on our email, which is toobroad2deeppod@gmail.com, and that's spelt with the word 2TOO. You can also contact us on Twitter and Instagram at toobroad2deeppod, which is with the number 2. And we're also on Facebook with the page Doctor Who, Too Broad and Too Deep Podcast. Thanks again for listening.